I usually start with a very badly drawn map of Germany, which is, I think, the first slide on that group. If you want to share the screen, if it's, I don't know how difficult it'll be to get it up and on. Yeah, this is, I probably should update this, but in any event, I wanted to generally give you an idea of the geography of what I'll be talking about. My father's hometown is, and I'll talk about that a little bit, is Leer, L-W-E-R, which is on the North Sea, very near the Dutch border of Netherlands. And I was born, and we'll be mentioning this town of Magdeburg, which is about 60 miles south of Berlin. My mother's home, which is my father's first assignment as a Jewish school teacher, is down here, is called Eder Oberstein. This is sort of in the Rhine Valley. And here in Frankfurt, the town of Frankfurt is identified. One of my father's sisters is there, and I'll mention I spent a little time there. So just to give you a geographical orientation. I wanted to, and I'll sort of go into a little bit of history. I think it's important to remember, remember before this horrible Holocaust got underway, and before Germany literally turned itself upside down philosophically and its laws, is that traditionally, the Jews in Germany considered themselves to be German and their religion to be Jewish. It did not, much like we ourselves to be Americans and either Jewish or whatever our religion might be. And for example, during the First World War, many Jewish men fought in the German army. And the next slide, Brittany, I think, is a photograph of my grandfather. If you can, that's him. Sigmund Schubach, that was his first name. This is my mother's father, and in his uniform during the First World War. We have another picture of him with his side view with a steel helmet, and my brother took that out of, it says about 1915. My mother was born in 1911, so he did a tour of duty away from his family. And I think that's pretty significant, and would explain why many Jews did not leave right away. But unfortunately, that's really what happened. So with that little bit of background, we will, if you'll go on to the next slide, there are one or two that I want to show you. This first one is a photograph of many of my relations going back to a large family on both on my father's side. Many of these photographs really are my dad's family. My mother's family came to the United States earlier in the 1936, but most of these families, most of these pictures are older. And actually, this is my grandmother holding my father. It says circa 1899. Dad was born in 1901, so it looks like he was probably about 3 or 4 years old already by then. So I'll just pass that on. It's the kind of photograph that many of you have of your own families going back, and I think it just emphasizes how that we all have some very deep long histories, whether in this country, Scotch-Irish, or wherever they came from. And then, of course, this history was totally abruptly changed with the Holocaust itself. So if you want to go to the next slide, that's a picture of my father. I'm going to put my mouse, I don't know if you can see the mouse. This is a picture of the 9 brothers and sisters in my father's family. The oldest one, Zemi, is my father's older brother. There's my dad, again, about 1920. And the sisters, I'm not going to name them all right now, but or I can actually, but the 2 that came to the United States. Initially, this is Martha, who went to New York, and Yetta, both of whom married independently, married butchers themselves who lived and that were from near the Dutch border. My Martha married Dan de Vries, and Yetta married a fellow named Nathan van der Wijk. Fritz was a younger brother who died at an earlier age, and then this is one of these. This is Ellie, my aunt, who was in Frankfurt, that I'll talk about a little bit more. This is Lena, who ended up going to Israel in the early 30s with her husband and became farmers in Israel and had a son my age who recently passed away that we visited in Israel. And then this is Corolla that ended up moved to Holland, that we'll talk about a little bit later. And it just gives you a sense. This was a large family. My grandmother's name on my dad's side was Wexler. It was a large family, and she was descended from 2 or 3 rabbis in the family. It was a very religious family that dated back quite far. In fact, when you go to the cemetery in Lair, you find quite a few grave sites with the name Rosenberg or Wexler on them. So let's see, I think John Harry. So that sort of takes us a little bit forward with my dad. Unfortunately, his father also died at a young age. And so when he was in high school, we sent my father to an orphanage in Hanover, which is a larger city. And he finished high school there and went on to the seminary to learn to become a Jewish school teacher. And he was very well, and he did. Becoming a Jewish school teacher was really quite a religious school teacher. It involved learning a great deal of Jewish history. And my father, when you go into a synagogue, those of you then you'll see up front, there is always an ark with an eternal light, a flame that's going on, but inside the ark are the Torahs, which are the 5 books of Moses, generally with a beautiful covering and some silver ornaments, and those are in Hebrew script. And my father literally learned them well enough that you could start him anywhere in those 5 books of Moses with a quotation, and he could finish the sentence for you. And so when he finished seminary probably around 1925, one of his very first assignments was to become the religious school teacher in my mother's hometown of Eder Oberstein. As I mentioned, it's in the Rhine Valley. It's a small town, and her father there was a butcher and had a butcher shop, and next door to it, actually, he had a slaughterhouse. He was not kosher, so he served both beef and also pork. And because he had explained that economically he didn't think in that small town it could ever be known he would ever be able to survive economically. So he had my mother had 2 younger sisters, and my father, when he moved to that community to teach a religious school, which was generally done outside of formal school classes. We have a picture, I don't have it here, of my dad with his students. He there met Gerda Rosenberg, Gerda Schubach, and started taking a liking to her. And I guess she was probably 16 or 17 back then. But he started taking his meals, eating his meals at the Schubach household lunch and dinner along, which was a fairly large group because it included the family, the three girls, and all the workers in the shop and in the next door, the slaughter, where he had the slaughterhouse. So fast forward in 2 years, by then my dad, after he had been there a few years, decided that he applied and was accepted in a position in Magdeburg, which was a larger Jewish community, and there became a school teacher and also started working and was working in the office in the Jewish welfare system there in Magdeburg. And they had initially lived in a little suburban apartment building a few miles away from the synagogue. My dad bicycled into work, and I was born in 1931. And I guess after a while, having a new baby in the house, it was more convenient. They moved into an apartment which was right next door to the synagogue. And my dad was employed in the afternoons. He worked, as I said, for the Jewish welfare system. So they lived moved into Magdeburg proper, and really were living what one would call a very nice middle class life. They had a lot of friends. I have a photograph. I think it's the next one. If you want to put, well, there are two coming up, and I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll break into the first. This is a photograph. This is a copy of the Magdeburg telephone book from 1938, which is the year of the Kristallnacht. You can't read the script very well. I'm sure you can't read it at all, but this is in the R's, and there's a notation, Rosenberg, Lehrer, L-E-H-R-E-R, the German word for teacher, Schulstrasse 2C, the number 2C, Schulstrasse, which was us, Department 2C, and the telephone number. So I always think that's a pretty good piece of evidence. Sometimes to the Holocaust deniers, at least it demonstrates that we were actually living in Magdeburg at the time. So you want to go on to the next slide itself. I think that's probably, this is a photograph of my mother walking in her nice dress with me and my brother. At that point, he looks like he's probably 3 or 4. Well, maybe he's not somewhere, maybe not even that old, because he was 2.5. This is right before Kristallnacht, and there was a nice park in Magdeburg, and we were, they had lots of friends, and I think they were pretty protective. I'm often asked, because I don't have that many real memories of this period other than growing up in a loving household with friends and going to services in the temple where my father assisted the rabbi. And so during these years, the 1930s that we're in now, of course, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler started introducing and implementing these terrible codes and laws which prevented Jewish shop owners from owning their stores, stopped lawyers from practicing law, and eventually and doctors from practicing. And for a while, interestingly to me, one of the exceptions was that if these men had worked or fought in the First World War, they were exempted from some of these terrible codes initially and were allowed to continue doing what they were doing. I think my father So, you know, it was understandable in some ways that many Jews uh, did not believe that this was getting worse and worse and was going to continue getting worse and worse. And so they were inclined to stay in Germany as their home. And you know, in retrospect, wondered why did they do, how did that come about? Well, I mean, many did not. I think a lot of Jewish men and women, a lot of families started to see the writing on the wall. And my grandfather, I think, sold his business to his chief worker, and then they went on over in 1936. The two sisters I mentioned earlier, Martha and Danny, also came over between 36 and 38. One of them literally was on her honeymoon, and they came to the United States, and Danny eventually opened a fairly large wholesale meat house, and Nathan was a butcher. He had 3 children, and he died, unfortunately, while the kids were very young. But getting back to this Magdeburg story, I want to mention that, you know, at one point during these 30s, one of the Jewish agencies sent the United Jewish Appeal, or one of the Jewish agencies, wanted to raise money in Magdeburg. And they asked around and said, well, we need someone to go to the folks who in this community knows people well enough where we can spend our time trying to raise some money. And they said, well, go see Rudy Rosenberg. He knows everybody. And you'll understand a little later why I mention this. And so the 2 fellows, I can't remember his name at the moment, but they spent several days visiting folks who had means and who were willing to contribute, and did. And I'll just put that in for you to remember for a little bit later. But eventually my father did get the message that things were getting bad. And he went to Berlin and spent a couple of days, I think, standing in line to get the number and the papers together that he needed to leave Germany if and when the time came, because you had to go to the consulate and you had to have your papers in order. And in fact, you had to show that you had a ticket or enough money to be able to get it. I guess you even had to have evidence that you could get on a ship and be able to leave. And so he did that late in the game, probably in 1938. So that brings us really, I think, up to Kristallnacht itself, which was November 11, 1938. And at that time, well, I should mention before that, just before this happened, I think in 1937, because we have a little slide coming up, that when I started school in somewhere in 1937, one of the laws that came from Hitler was that the Jewish students would no longer be allowed to be in school with Christian students, and so they were segregated out. And so my father and one of his colleagues started a separate school for Jewish students. And then I was in his class, his first class. And I have here, if you want to go to the next slide, you'll see a photograph of me on the first day of school. I tell students education will be no secret to any of you that education is very important, really in Europe, but certainly in Germany. And so the first day of school was a big deal. And they give you, and traditionally a lot of the students, as I was this day, given one of these big cones full of goodies, school supplies, candy, and that sort of thing. So that was my first day of school, and off I went to my father's school. That, which brings us then to Kristallnacht. As I said, by that time actually, the apartment building that we were in was sort of perpendicular to the synagogue. They were, not sure that they were fastened to each other, but there was a big courtyard out front in which I learned to ride a bicycle. There was a family upstairs, a family from Poland. And if you read this history, you'll see that the Polish Jews were picked up before anybody else. And I think in October of 1938, I think their name was Finkelstein, that all of a sudden they were gone. They'd been arrested and they were taken, like so many other Polish Jews, to the border, where I think there was a dispute initially whether Poland would even accept them. There was another family upstairs where the young daughter was a babysitter to us, to my brother particularly, who was then, I think, only 2. And they oftentimes, my parents went out, they left. Harry is my brother's name. I should mention my sister Teresa Joan, was born in the United States. She's a little younger than we are. She's in her 70s and was born here. But in any event, on Kristallnacht, we went to bed, and during that night, all of a sudden, they rousted us out of our apartment. The Nazis banged on the door and took us out to the courtyard where we stood, my mother holding my brother and my father. And at that point, his mother was visiting us, and perhaps his brother, I don't think so, but his mother was visiting with us. And so they then proceeded to go into the synagogue and to dynamite the synagogue. And they brought the prayer books out into the courtyard. And some of the Torahs, not all of them, I don't believe, but they made a big bonfire in the courtyard, which they had us watch. And then they dynamited the synagogue. Virtually all the other synagogues around Germany were burned down, including the one in Leer, my dad's hometown. And but we were told that because there was a hospital next door or nearby, they were afraid if they started a fire that it would also damage the hospital. So while we were standing there guarded by one of the guards, one of the Nazis who was holding his gun, my mother asked him whether they were going to kill us. And he said he did not know, and which she remembered. And she very well, people say, well, what do you remember? And I remember the bonfire. I remember the next day going into the synagogue, and I'll show you the photograph, but in a minute. But my mom said, all I could say was alles kaputt. Alles kaputt means everything is broken. And so then they finally let us back into the apartment, and things were in disarray. They had really ransacked the place and made it pretty much unlivable. They did. So if you want to go on to the next 2 slides, this is just a photograph of what the inside of an ark that I described to you looked like. Go on to the next one. This was the one, I'm not sure when that was taken. This is what the synagogue looked like the next morning, which I remembered pretty well. I hadn't been back in there. I had this picture until I saw this picture again, or saw it for the first time. It really rang a bell. These photographs, I think, came from the archives in Magdeburg, my nephew, my brother's son, Dan, who teaches in the honors program at the University of Oregon, has done a lot of genealogy and looking back at this particular period, has been back to Leer and been back to Magdeburg, and and also was with artwork with the archivist. I think that's where these photographs are from. So the next morning, I remember that after we went back into the apartment, they put my mom and dad had a mattress for me. They put on the kitchen floor, and I was awakened the next morning. The Nazis knocked on the door, and they came to arrest my father and to take him away. We didn't know exactly where he was going. I remind people, my mom, like a good Jewish mother, said, "Can you wait a few minutes before you take him? Because I want to give him a sandwich to take along." And the fellow said he did, but he wouldn't. He didn't stay very long and took him away. And so my mom finished the sandwich and gave it to me and said, "Here, go down, follow your dad down the street and give him the sandwich," which I did. They apparently arrested about 125 Jewish men, including the rabbi from Magdeburg, who my dad worked with. And they actually thought they were going to come home that night. It turned out they crammed them into a couple of jail cells, and then they took them on to Buchenwald and to the concentration camp. In the meantime, my mother then, because our apartment was unlivable, among other things, she took my brother to the babysitter's house. They had moved to another location, and I'll tell you a little more about that. And she sent me by train to Frankfurt to be with my aunt, Ellie. They had a son whose name was Booby, who was my age. And so I was quite at home with them. The babysitter, who with her mom and dad, the babysitter had a brother whose name was Arno. And it turns out that Arno, when he was 13, got a little older, was actually sent to the United States on a kinderlift. Many of you people may know that a lot of Jewish families, quite a few anyway, who saw the writing in the wall but were not able to get their papers together and to leave, were able to get their children out and sent them to families and friends and foster homes in the United States. And Arno went to a family in Detroit. When he was of age, he joined the army and came back, married a woman when he was stationed in England, he met a woman in the RAF and they got married, and he returned to Detroit, and they had 3 daughters. And it turns out that 2 of the daughters, of Arno's daughters, are here in Kentucky. One of them is a psychologist in Somerset, and one of them is a physical therapist in at Cardinal Hill. And we didn't know about this connection until a few years ago. And one day I got an email from Julie, the psychologist in Somerset, and said, "Are you John Rosenberg, who's from Magdeburg?" And so that's since then we've become very good friends and seen each other. But the sister, unfortunately, the family other than Arno did not get out. And the 2 daughters have been back to Magdeburg at memorial services for their family. And they have some memorial markers called Doppelsteins. And they've been back, and they have some letters and documentation of the last days of the family, a very poignant letter that the father wrote. In any event, that's where we were during this concentration camp. So my father spent 17 pretty horrific days in Buchenwald, along with the members of the other folks who were men who had been arrested. My dad never went into very much detail about those days, but he would just say he was determined to live through them. Some days they just stood all day. Pretty horrific. About 25 of their number either were killed or committed suicide. We found later a diary that the rabbi had himself kept while he was there. His name was Wilde, W-I-L-D-E. It's not very long, but it tells how difficult, certainly describes how difficult the period was. And I always take a moment to say Dr. Wilde had a long beard. And I remember it was sort of what he looked like. And as the men were being released on the day of their release, they required them to be shaved, to have their heads shaved. And they were going to shave off Dr. Wilder's beard. And he said, he didn't want him to shave it. And he said, well, ask your superior if I can keep it. And the superior said no. And he went up the line about 2 or 3, wouldn't take no for an answer. And before they left, there was a message on the loudspeaker that said, Dr. Wilde can keep his beard, which I always thought was really a rather quite remarkable. But they were able to get out at that time. And I'm often asked how did they get out? Well, the final solution had not been agreed. They didn't really yet have their plan in place to keep to kill the 6 million Jews, which eventually they did. I've learned that some of the concentration camps themselves had different rules, and it probably, fortunately, in Buchenwald, that my dad, I know that my mother and the women who were left behind would go to the police station, the mayor, and to others to try to see if they could help get them out. And we're not sure exactly what happened, but eventually they were released. The ones who were left, and my dad and his brother, who was also in Buchenwald, ended up coming first to Frankfurt, and when they showed up with their heads shaved, and my father was united at least with me, and then went back to Magdeburg, and they had 30 days to get out of the country. They were given 30 days. And I think the next, if you want to go to the next slide, this is a picture of the release of my father from the concentration camp Buchenwald. He was in on the 11th of 1938, and he was released on the 27th. And so that's one of the documents that we were able to keep and that he had with him. So my father had, as I mentioned, one of the sisters had gone to Rotterdam, or was in Rotterdam. She was married to a businessman who did some importing, and they had 3 children at the time. And I think that's really the reason that we were able to go to Rotterdam. He had a passport, and we ended up in a detention camp, which is a large, at that time, the Dutch government had set aside buildings to house European Jews or Jews from other countries who were making their way to Holland because the war hadn't started and they were looking for a safe place to live if they couldn't get out from where they were. And in this case, the detention camp was in an overnight hostelry for people who were going to leave on the Holland-America line the next day. It was right there across from the location where the ship left. And there were 3 or 4 floors of this building. And if you spent the night, if you had a nice cabin the next day, you could stay in a cabin you probably had a nice overnight cabin. We were sort of in the middle of, I suppose, we were in a little area, wooden walls with 2 bunks on either side. It's probably 10 by 10, and the bunks were for Mom and my father, and 2 for my brother and for me. And that's where we stayed for a little over a year. But during that time, when my father saw all these kids running around that didn't have anything to do, he started a school without any textbooks, but he started a school for the children. And life went on. And during that period, they were contacting our relatives in the United States to see whether there would be of finding a way to come to the United States. My dad learned then one day that since he had done such a good job starting this school, that the Dutch government let him know they wanted him to open a school in a new camp that they were opening for Jewish immigrants called Westerbork. And Westerbork became the transition camp where the Jews that were, after the war started, were picked up every week by the Germans in Holland, and they were brought to Westerbork, and every Tuesday, I think it was, the train would leave with a trainload of people and were taken to Auschwitz where they were murdered. My dad, when he heard that he was going to go to Westerbork, had a premonition of sorts and realized, or he thought, that if he went to Westerbork, that would be the end. We'd never get out. And he had heard that in the meantime, that the Jewish agencies had set up a committee to decide how to set up some priorities for who would be able to get out and who would not, or at least a system for who's going to get on the ship, because there just wasn't room to get everybody out. So he told us that he waited for the end of the day. He found out where the committee met, and he waited till it was over. And finally, when he thought the last person had left, he knocked on the door and to go see this committee. And when he opened the door, the man behind the desk said, "Rosenberg, what are you doing here?" And it turned out to be the same person who had been fundraising with him in Magdeburg that I told you about earlier on. And so, of course, my father told him what he was hoping to do. And he said, "Well, I'll see what I can do for you." I guess we'll never know whether that was the trick that did it, but we were able to leave on the ship, one of the last ships to leave Holland and come to this country, on the Holland America line. The ticket, we learned at that point, my father had sold. They didn't have any money really left, but I want to remind people the ticket was paid for by the agency HIAS, HIAS. And back then they worked primarily with Jewish refugees, but now they work with refugees all over the world. You can Google them, HIAS, and I'd be happy for you to donate in the Rudy Rosenberg's honor, or whatever. But they're a wonderful agency, and indeed they paid for the ticket to bring us over. So we left in February, and I'm sure for a young 8-year-old, it was an adventure. On the ship, I was able to see the first colorized version of a movie from the United States, The Wizard of Oz. You didn't have to know much language to follow the plot, but we arrived here on February 22nd at Perth Amboy. At that point, Ellis Island was closed and had been closed, and all the flags were out. And we thought, wow, this is a really nice way to greet us. And of course, it turned out it was George Washington's birthday, now called President's Day. But we were greeted on the ship by my mother's sisters who had come here, and one of those, her sister Irma, who gave me a quarter and told me it was a lot of money and to hang on to it. And so we moved in Washington Heights with my mother's family, and I should mention my father. Actually, we were finally my father's sister. The immediate family, didn't have any money, but back then and still today, if you are going to stand good for somebody, if you're going to help somebody come in, you have to sign a statement that you can take care of them economically. And so that was a difficult task. And my aunt finally found a very distant relation, an architect whose name was Meyer, downtown in New York, and he was willing to sponsor us. And my dad afterwards went to see him and said, "Thank you so much for what you did for us." He said, "You're welcome." And that was the last they ever saw of each other. Although he had a son, Charles, who ended up years later living near my brother in Bethesda, Maryland, and they became good friends. But in any event, I'm sure we're reaching the end of the line. We came to the United States, and my father then couldn't find work in New York easily, and no one advised him how to become a school teacher here. So he ended up in Spartanburg, South Carolina, sweeping floors in a textile mill during the week and being a sort of an itinerant rabbi for two communities that didn't have rabbi in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Gastonia, North Carolina. And over the years, he worked himself up from being a janitor to being an office manager in Gastonia. After about 6 months in Spartanburg, he'd saved enough money to bring us to Spartanburg, and we lived there three years. And I quickly learned that you could you could deliver newspapers when you were 12 years old. One of the first presents I ever got from my family was a bicycle, so I could deliver the Spartanburg Herald Leader, Herald Journal, I think it was called. And then we moved to Gastonia, and that's where I spent from the 5th grade on up, and became an Eagle Scout. Scouting was very important to me. Became president of my class my sophomore and senior years, and had a good record in high school, and went on to Duke University on a tuition scholarship for a year, and then stayed working in the dining halls for the next few years at Chem Major. And then I was a ROTC and became a navigator in the United States Air Force for 3 or 4 years, and came out and went to law school to eventually go to the Civil Rights Division. And I'll just close with you to say that, and probably in retrospect, when you think about my mom and dad today, we're seeing the same thing with Ukraine people, those who are alive and who are able to get out with very little but the clothes on their back. My mom and dad left with very little more than that, and ended up being plunked into the middle of a segregated society in the South. And he'd say, "Well, how could you have lived in a segregated society?" And I'd say, "Well, these days back then, they were very patriotic, of course. They had Franklin Roosevelt's picture on the wall, and it wouldn't have mattered where we would have ended up in this country. They were so glad to be alive and to live in wherever we were." And so years later, being able to work in the Civil Rights Division of Justice, I was able to do a little something I'd hoped that would end up changing this awful system of segregation that we have in the South. So I think with that, I'll stop. It's probably right at 8 o'clock. I see it is. And I don't know if there are how long you want to go on, but I'm happy to answer any questions or just take a deep breath.
John, I think we'd probably like to ask you some questions if you have time to stay on, but I did want to say one thing. You told us about your degrees, but I'm not sure everyone knows that you are the Director Emeritus of the Appalachian Research and Defense Fund of Kentucky, Appalred Legal Service Program, serving low-income clients and groups in 37 counties in eastern and south central Kentucky. And that, I'm sure, was a very wonderful career, and I'm sure you've helped many, many people. Your story is fascinating.
Nice of you to mention that, Mary. I mean, I stopped at the Civil Rights Division, but after I'd been a trial lawyer and a section chief at the division for 8 years, and Gina and I felt that the enforcement of civil rights was not what it ought to be under the Nixon administration. And we've been in Houston, Texas, trying a big school case. So we decided we'd probably been there long enough, and we ended up in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. We only have so much time, but we ended up learning about the opportunity to be in Appalachia to initially work on things on symptomatic issues of poverty, the coal-related places, the coal-related issues that involve mining, black lung disease, and mine safety, and environmental problems related to surface mining. And then over time, as Civil Legal Aid got a little bit more funding, we opened offices in 10 rural locations in eastern and south central Kentucky to deal with the poverty law issues that are prevalent: family law, consumer cases, social security, and housing matters, and things I can talk about another 2 hours, but
we might have to have you come back, John. You've got so much.
Well, I'm happy to talk about civil legal aid or the public defender system. I'm a fan of both. I've been on the commission that oversees the defender system. I think I saw Ed Monahan on for a while at one point, who was a former public defender, of course, and a great hero of mine.
Well, Ed did make a comment. He said that you litigated the first case to enforce the new voting rights law, was his comment.
Yep. Well,
yes. And then
it was in Selma, Alabama, in the first time that Blacks had a opportunity to vote in very large numbers, and the first time they had Black voting officials, and the officials were a little bit slow counting votes. And so the white executive committee, about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, decided to impound all the boxes that the Black votes had been counted in. They were primarily in Black precincts. And the next day they thought, well, the fair thing to do is just not count any of those votes. We'll just let the election be what it is without those votes. And Jim Clark. It turned out that Jim Clark, who was that awful sheriff in Selma and in Dallas County, Alabama, was running for re-election as well, and the result might have been different. So we filed a lawsuit to require them to count those votes, and the judge held that they had been held after a trial. Jean and her roommate, who is also now a lawyer, who was a paralegal, they were in charge of taking care of those ballots in the courthouse or in the sheriff's office. And I almost had to put her on the stand, but I didn't. That was before we were married, but that was one of the final, convinced me that we ought to get married. And I was 55, now it's 55 years later.
Oh, how wonderful.
It was a sort of a historic trial, and appreciate Ed mentioning that.
Yeah, there was a comment also. You have a fan from Duluth, Minnesota, Fred Friedman, who I believe is a public defender. And he said, always an honor to listen to John. You are a true national hero. And he's listening from Duluth.
Wow. Well, thank you. I'm not sure I feel I'm a national hero, but I do think it's important to continue having people be aware of the Holocaust. And I'm glad to say that Kentucky is one of some group of states that now require Holocaust, or in our statute says, or genocide education in the schools. And and I know that at the University of Kentucky, Karen Petrone, who teaches history and Holocaust education, I think they just got a grant to implement some teacher training sessions around the state to develop a sort of a model curriculum. I mean, various teachers have been doing it in various ways over time, and I think this is maybe the boost we need to try to move that along. I mean, I'm happy to talk to groups, but talking to one school here and one other school. In some schools, there are teachers who are more involved who are put this up at a higher priority than others. But we're getting there.
Great. Mark Scar, and you may not have seen this in the chat, but he said he's wondering if you know his brother, Tom Scar, who has been president of the Huntington Temple.
I do. Scars.
Well, Mark is
I'm
on.
glad you know his judge. I think Tom is now a judge.
Yes, he got appointed to be a judge. Did you ever know my father?
What's your dad's name?
His name is David Scar. He's passed away, but he was born in 1921, so he was about 10 years older than you are.
Yeah, well, our Huntington Association doesn't go back that far. In fact, we used to go to Williamson, West Virginia, and when that synagogue was closed, we got to know the folks in Huntington a little bit better. So I do know your brother, and I wanted to send him a note. I think isn't it the appeals court that he was appointed to? I just saw something.
Yes, I'll transfer any message that you like. Actually, I'll see if I can find his email. I'll put my email address in there, and if you send me yours, I'll get you his email address.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I think it may be in the congregation book, but anyway, I'm glad to make the association. I appreciate you being on.
Well, I appreciate your presentation. Yes, he's now retired from being a lawyer.
There's Mark's email, but also Mark, if John doesn't get that, I can email him your email. So we'll connect you. We did have a question, John, from Sharon Stewart. We were confused about what year did you actually come with your family to the United States?
1940.
It was 1940. Okay,
Yeah.
Great.
February 22nd, 1940.
Do we have any other comments or questions for John? John, it's been such a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for this amazing history. I am a history buff, so it was right down my alley, but I'm sure other people were thrilled to hear what is a terrible history, but still one that we need to know. I know that I hope it's something that we all remember as we elect our representatives to lead our government in both its foreign and domestic policies. So we thank you so much. And there will be a recording of this program available next week on the League of Women Voters of Lexington website, lwvlexington.com, or on our outreach circle. And we're having lots of comments in the chats about how wonderful. I do have just a few things that aren't connected to this presentation tonight, John, but these are things coming up with the League. Please join us in person on Friday, June 10th, 2022, 5 p.m. at the Henry Clay Home, Ashland in Lexington, as we take part in the dedication of the Madeline McDowell Breckinridge Suffragist Marker. All are welcome and light refreshments will be served. And then on June 11th, 2022, via Zoom, the State League of Women Voters presents our state convention from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. It is open to all. Find the link for the Zoom on our lwvlexington.com website or an outreach circle. And then thanks to all of you who participated in our democracy by voting in the May 2022 primary election. It takes all of us to keep our government and leaders accountable. Stay informed for the November 2022 election by joining Outreach Circle using vote411.org and by viewing our candidate forums available later in the fall on our website. John, thanks so much again, and to your wife. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
Well, I just wanted to say, I should have wanted to mention that I'm happy that I see our daughter Annie Rosenberg has joined, and I wanted to mention that our two kids, Annie, who's in Versailles with her partner Warren Keller, and our son Michael, who is an administrator at Penn State, along with his wife Pam Wilcox, who's a criminologist and researcher and a fine PhD up there. So I wanted to include them in the family. So
great. I'm glad you did. I did wonder. I figured you had to have some amazing children.
Well, we're proud of them for sure.
Yes, I can understand. You have an amazing family. Thank you again so much, John. And it was good to meet you and your wife, and everybody's been making wonderful comments about this program. And I'm sure those that missed tonight will be able to listen on our recording.
Click on the chat.
Wonderful.
Oh, there's something from Ann Rosenberg. What did she say? Oh, thanks everyone. It was great to be here. That's from Annie Rosenberg. Glad she was here. All right. Are we ready to say good night, everyone? Or